I was standing in the parking lot of the hospital, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. My father, Justice Thomas Calloway of the Supreme Court, was recovering from heart surgery inside. And our family home, the house he had lived in for over 40 years, had just been bulldozed. Not damaged, not remodeled, demolished. I had been the one to get the call from a neighbor. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Then, when I heard the sheer panic in their voice, I knew it was real. I drove straight from the hospital, expecting to see some mistake, some minor construction I hadn't heard about. But when I turned onto our street, I nearly ran my car off the road. The house was gone. All that remained was a pile of rubble, the front steps still eerily intact, leading to nothing but destruction. Pieces of my childhood old bricks, shattered glass, the remains of the porch swing were strewn across the lot. A thick layer of dust coated everything. And standing at the edge of the wreckage, clipboard in hand, was her. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She was a middle-aged woman with the kind of permanent scowl that made it seem like she smelled something bad at all times. She wore a crisp beige blazer like she was running a corporate boardroom instead of a neighborhood association. Her arms were crossed as she surveyed the destruction like she was admiring a job well done. I parked so fast, I barely remembered pulling the keys from the ignition. Storming up to her, I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. "What the hell happened here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. Karen turned to face me, her expression entirely devoid of concern. "Oh, hello, Catherine. I was wondering when you'd show up." I clenched my fists. "What happened to my father's house?" She sighed dramatically, flipping through her clipboard. "Your father's property had numerous violations. The lawn was overgrown, the house was in disrepair, and it was bringing down property values. We sent multiple notices, and when we received no response, we were forced to take action." I stared at her, my brain refusing to process what she was saying. "You demolished his house because of some HOA notices." Karen raised an eyebrow, as if I was the unreasonable one. "We followed all procedures. He failed to respond, so we assumed abandonment." Abandonment. My father had lived in that house for decades. He was a sitting Supreme Court judge, not some absentee homeowner. The only reason he hadn't responded was because he had been in the hospital fighting for his life. "You had no right," I seethed. "That house wasn't abandoned." "My father is in the hospital." Karen's lips pursed. "Well, that's unfortunate, but the HOA has its rules. If he wanted to keep the property, he should have responded to the notices." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You're going to pay for this." Karen let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "Catherine, the HOA operates within its rights. We have legal authority over properties in this community. If you want to challenge it, go ahead, but I promise you, it won't get you anywhere." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing in the ruins of my father's home. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before I heard his voice, weak but steady. "Cat," my father's voice was hoarse from the surgery. "Everything okay?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Dad, I need you to listen to me carefully." I didn't have to say much. By the time I finished my explanation, there was a long silence. Then, in the calmest, most measured tone, he said, "Get me my legal team." I stood in the wreckage of my father's home, the dust thick in the air, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a vice. Karen Whitmore had walked away as if this was nothing more than another box checked off her HOA to-do list. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time I reached the hospital, my father was already sitting up in his bed, his eyes sharper than they had been in days. His recovery had been slow, but nothing ignited his spirit quite like an injustice, and this was beyond anything we'd ever faced. His legal team arrived within the hour. 5 lawyers, each one more furious than the last as they pored over the HOA's supposed justification for demolishing the house. A quiet tension filled the hospital room as pages flipped. Pens scratched against legal pads, and whispers of legal jargon passed between them. Then one of them, a man named Robert Langston, set his papers down and exhaled sharply. "They overstepped," he said, his voice firm. "There's no question about it. Even if the HOA had issued violations, even if they followed their so-called procedures, they had no authority to demolish a privately owned home. They acted like they owned the property," another lawyer added, shaking her head. "Even if they had placed liens on it for unpaid fines, they still would have needed to go through the courts before taking any action. And they didn't. They bypassed due process entirely." My father, ever composed, nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure they regret it." Robert leaned forward. "We're looking at multiple violations here. Destruction of private property, unlawful seizure, fraud if they filed false documents, and possibly criminal conspiracy if multiple members of the HOA were involved in orchestrating this." My grip tightened on the armrest of the chair. "And what does that mean for them?" "It means they're in serious trouble," Robert replied. "We're not just talking about a civil lawsuit. We're talking about potential criminal charges." My father's gaze darkened. "Then let's begin." Within an hour, the legal team was making calls, filing emergency motions, and gathering every piece of documentation necessary. I could already see the storm forming on the horizon, and this HOA had no idea what was coming for them. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA's office with a court order in hand. The building was a modest structure in the heart of the neighborhood, a place where homeowners were called in to be reprimanded for minor infractions like a mailbox being slightly crooked or a garden gnome being too garish. I walked through the doors, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I approached the receptionist. She barely glanced up before lazily asking if I had an appointment. "I don't need one," I said, placing the folder on the counter. "This is a court order requiring all HOA records related to my father's property be turned over immediately." The receptionist blinked, then sat up straighter. I need to get Miss Whitmore. Go ahead." Moments later, Karen appeared, her expression a mix of irritation and forced politeness. "Catherine, this is highly irregular. You can't just barge in here making demands." I slid the folder toward her. "That's not a request, it's a legal order. We're coming after you, Karen. You and everyone who had a hand in this." She scanned the document, her fingers tightening around the edges. For the first time, her confidence wavered. This is ridiculous." "The HOA had every right." "No, you didn't," I cut in. "And you know it." Behind her, a few other board members had gathered, whispering among themselves. One of them, a man in a cheap suit, looked particularly uneasy. "Good, let them stew in it." Karen squared her shoulders. "You're making a mistake challenging us." I leaned in, my voice steady. "No, Karen, you made the mistake." She stood there, gripping the folder like it was the last thing tethering her to control, but she had already lost it. As I turned to leave, I caught the murmurs growing behind me. The HOA's tight grip over the community had just started to slip, and they knew it. By the time I got back to the hospital, my father was on the phone with a judge. He was making sure no loophole would save the HOA from what was coming. His expression was unreadable, but I knew him well enough to recognize when he was setting something in motion. When he hung up, he looked at me. "They're going to regret everything." I sat beside him, my heart pounding with anticipation. "What's next?" "Next," he said, "we make sure they never do this to anyone else again." The air inside the courtroom was heavy with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting an unforgiving glow over the HOA board members seated at the defense table. Karen Whitmore sat at the center, her lips pressed together in a thin line, her fingers clasped so tightly they were turning white. Across from them, my father sat beside our legal team, his posture impeccable despite still recovering from surgery. His presence alone was enough to unnerve them. This wasn't just another petty HOA dispute over mailbox colors or improperly trimmed hedges. This was a case of unlawful destruction, property seizure, and fraud. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses and flipped through the case file. Then she looked up, her expression unreadable. "This is one of the most egregious abuses of power I've ever seen from a homeowners association," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You demolished a private residence without due process, without a court order, and under the flimsy justification that it was abandoned despite the fact that the owner was recovering from surgery at the time." Karen cleared her throat, shifting in her seat. "Your Honor, the HOA acted within what we believe to be our rights. The property was in clear violation of neighborhood standards, and we followed our established procedures." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Your procedures do not supersede state law. You do not have the authority to seize or destroy private property without legal due process. I find it difficult to believe that you were unaware of this." One of the HOA's attorneys leaned forward, adjusting his tie with a nervous twitch. "Your Honor, if I may, the board was operating under the assumption that..." The judge cut him off with a withering look. "You assumed wrong." I glanced at my father, who remained composed, though I could see the fire burning behind his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. His mere presence was enough to remind them they had made the worst mistake of their lives. Our lead attorney, Robert Langston, stood and approached the bench, his tone measured but firm. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation proving that the HOA not only failed to follow legal protocol, but actively fabricated violations. We have witness statements from neighbors who confirm that the demolition crew arrived without warning, and we have financial records indicating that board members were potentially profiting from the unlawful seizure of properties under similar circumstances." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karen's expression faltered for the first time. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to her attorneys, but they offered no comfort. They knew what was coming. The judge exhaled slowly, tapping a pen against her desk. "You have financial records to support this claim?" Robert nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We obtained records showing that certain board members have been involved in a pattern of targeting older homeowners and those with financial difficulties. They would fabricate violations, impose steep fines, and when homeowners failed to pay often because they were unaware the HOA would declare the property abandoned. Then they would sell the properties to developers for a profit." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Karen's face drained of color. The judge leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "This goes beyond a simple civil case. If these allegations hold, we're looking at criminal charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy and possibly even racketeering." Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. She turned to her fellow board members, but they avoided eye contact. The man in the cheap suit, the one who had looked uneasy in the HOA office, was now visibly sweating. My father finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "Your Honor, I request that all HOA board members involved in these actions be placed under investigation immediately. Additionally, we are seeking full financial restitution for the destruction of my home, as well as compensatory and punitive damages." The judge nodded. "That request is more than reasonable. I will be issuing an immediate injunction against the HOA's authority until a full investigation is conducted. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution." That was the moment Karen Whitmore finally lost control. She shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "You can't do this. We were protecting property values. The HOA has the right to enforce community standards." The judge's gaze turned ice cold. "What you did was criminal, and you're about to face the consequences." Security officers stepped forward as Karen began to protest further, but it was useless. The board members who had once stood beside her were now scrambling, whispering hurriedly to their attorneys, distancing themselves from her as fast as they could. As the proceedings wrapped up, I turned to my father. "Looks like they finally realized they're not untouchable." He gave a small nod, exhaustion creeping into his features, but there was satisfaction there as well. Justice always catches up to those who think they can act without consequences. By the time we left the courthouse, the HOA was in complete disarray. Their assets were frozen pending investigation, their authority stripped, and their leadership facing potential jail time. The community, once under their oppressive rule, was finally free. And as for Karen Whitmore, she was led away in handcuffs 2 weeks later, charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful destruction of property. Justice had been served. The fallout from the courtroom ruling hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Homeowners who had once cowered under Karen Whitmore's rule were now emboldened, coming forward with their own stories of unjust fines, forced compliance, and intimidation tactics. Residents who had stayed silent out of fear were now gathering in groups, swapping horror stories about the HOA's reign of terror. And at the center of it all was the undeniable truth: this wasn't just about my father's house. This was about an entire neighborhood that had been held hostage by a corrupt board bent on controlling everything. While Karen and several of her closest allies were facing legal consequences, the remaining board members scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The ones who had been complicit but not directly involved in the demolition were panicked, trying to salvage what they could. But the damage was done. The HOA's authority had been suspended pending investigation, and that meant they no longer had the power to enforce anything. That didn't stop some of them from trying. 2 days after the court hearing, I was at the remains of my father's property, overseeing the cleanup efforts. We had hired a private crew to clear the rubble, documenting everything for the lawsuit. The workers moved carefully, retrieving anything salvageable. Broken picture frames, shattered tiles from the kitchen floor, my father's old mailbox now bent and dented but still recognizable. It was a painful process, but necessary. I was standing near the edge of the lot when I noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was William Hargrove, one of the HOA board members who had avoided direct legal trouble but had certainly benefited from the corruption. He was a wiry man in a navy sweater vest, his thinning hair slicked back in a desperate attempt to maintain some illusion of authority. His expression was tense, but he tried to mask it with forced confidence. I didn't have the patience for whatever he was about to say. He cleared his throat, stopping a few feet away. "Catherine, I wanted to have a word." I didn't turn to face him fully. "If it's about the lawsuit, talk to my father's legal team." "It's not about the lawsuit," he said quickly. "It's about the neighborhood, the HOA. Well, we're trying to figure out how to move forward. This situation has put us in a difficult position." I finally looked at him. "Your situation was created by your own greed. You helped enforce policies that stole from homeowners, and now you're concerned about how to move forward." His jaw tightened. "Look, I wasn't directly involved in the demolition. That was Karen's doing. I didn't even know about it until it was too late." I crossed my arms. "You didn't know, or you didn't care enough to stop it," he hesitated. "I didn't have the power to stop her." That made me laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You had power. You just didn't use it because you were too busy enjoying the benefits of a corrupt system." His face reddened. The HOA isn't all bad. We do provide structure. Without us, this neighborhood will fall into chaos. Property values will plummet, and I held up a hand, cutting him off. William, let me make something very clear. The HOA lost its legitimacy the moment it decided to act as judge, jury, and executioner over people's homes. No one here trusts you anymore. No one wants your structure, they want fairness. They want their rights back. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew he was losing. His gaze flickered to the debris behind me and his shoulders slumped. So what happens now? That's up to the community, I said. But if you think you can just sweep this under the rug and continue business as usual, you're in for a rude awakening. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded stiffly and walked away, his steps slower than when he arrived. By the time the sun started to set, I had spoken to several neighbors who had come by to offer support. Some wanted to help with the cleanup. Others just wanted to see the destruction firsthand, to remind themselves that the HOA's unchecked power had finally been challenged. One of them, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, clutched my hand before leaving. "You and your father did something we all wanted to do but were too afraid to," she said. "Thank you." That night, I sat in my father's hospital room, updating him on everything. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable as I recounted my conversation with William Hargrove. After I finished, he nodded slowly. "They're afraid," he said. "Good, they should be." I leaned back in my chair. "What happens if the HOA tries to re-establish itself after this?" "They won't," he said simply. "Not in the way they want to. Any attempt to reinstate their authority will be under legal scrutiny. And if they try to pull anything like this again, the consequences will be even worse." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling between us. The fight wasn't entirely over, but the hardest part was behind us. Finally, he spoke again. "Catherine, I want you to consider something." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The community will need new leadership," he said. "Someone to ensure this never happens again." I frowned. "You're not suggesting—" "I am," he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You've already proven you're willing to stand up for what's right. Why not take it a step further?" I stared at him, processing his words. The idea hadn't even crossed my mind. But as I thought about everything that had happened, about the people who had thanked me, the neighbors who had finally found their voices, it didn't seem so far-fetched. I exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I actually meant it. In the weeks following the court ruling, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. The once feared HOA board was in complete disarray. Karen Whitmore was facing multiple felony charges, and the remaining board members were scrambling to avoid being dragged down with her. Investigators were combing through the HOA's financial records, uncovering years of fraudulent fines, embezzled funds, and illegal property seizures. Despite their desperate attempts to distance themselves from Karen, several board members resigned in disgrace. Without leadership or legal standing, the HOA had effectively collapsed. The power they once wielded over the neighborhood was gone, and for the first time in years, the community was free from their grip. But that didn't mean the damage had been undone. The destruction of my father's home had been the most publicized incident, but as more residents came forward, it became clear that countless others had suffered at the hands of the HOA. Elderly homeowners had been forced to sell their properties due to fabricated violations and excessive fines. Families had been harassed over minor infractions. The entire system had been built on intimidation and greed. With the HOA dismantled, the question now was, what came next? One evening, I attended a gathering at the local community center, where residents had come together to discuss the future of the neighborhood. The room buzzed with anxious energy as people voiced their concerns. Some were worried about property values, Others feared that without an HOA, chaos would take over. An older gentleman, Mr. Delgado, stood near the front of the room, his voice steady. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and had seen it change under the HOA's rule. We need structure, but not the kind we had before. No more unchecked power. No more intimidation. A woman in the back crossed her arms. So what? We just let people do whatever they want. What if someone paints their house neon green? A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but the concern was genuine. The idea of no governing body at all made some residents uneasy. They had grown used to the rigid control of the HOA, even if it had been oppressive. I stepped forward. We don't need another HOA. What we need is a homeowners coalition and advisory group, not an enforcement body. Something that allows the community to have a say in how things are handled without giving power to a few individuals who can abuse it. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. A few people nodded, considering the idea. Mr. Delgado gestured toward me. If that's the case, we need leadership that we can trust. All eyes turned to me. I felt a weight settle on my shoulders. My father had already suggested this, but hearing it from the community made it real. They wanted someone to ensure that the neighborhood wouldn't fall back into corruption, but they didn't want another authoritarian regime. I took a deep breath. If the community wants me to help organize this, I will, but this won't be another HOA. It will be a council of homeowners who work together. No fines, no punishments. Just people looking out for each other. A round of applause broke out, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something shift, not just for me but for everyone in the room. The fear was gone, the control was gone, and in its place was something new, hope. As the meeting wrapped up, I walked outside, the cool evening air helping clear my mind. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I saw my father's name on the screen, I answered immediately. He sounded stronger than he had in weeks. How did the meeting go? I leaned against my car. Better than expected. They want change. Real change. And you? I hesitated, glancing back at the community center where people were still talking in small groups, their faces lighter than they had been in a long time. I think I do too. There was a pause on the other end before he spoke again. Then you know what to do. I did. The next morning, I started drafting a proposal for the homeowners coalition. It would be different from the HOA in every way. No unchecked authority, no arbitrary rules, and most importantly, no financial exploitation. Just a group of residents looking out for one another. As I worked, I received a call from Robert Langston, our lead attorney. His tone was clipped but satisfied. Thought you'd like to know Karen Whitmore just accepted a plea deal. I set my pen down. What's she getting? 10 years, no parole. I let that sink in. It wasn't just about her imprisonment, it was about the message it sent. Corruption had consequences. Abuse of power wouldn't go unpunished. Good, I said simply. She deserves it, Robert chuckled. I figured you'd say that, and one more thing, the lawsuit for damages. The court ruled in our favor. The HOA's remaining assets are being liquidated to compensate victims, including your father. I exhaled. It wouldn't bring back the home we lost, but it was justice. After the call, I walked outside and watched as neighbors helped repair fences, repaint homes, and restore what the HOA had taken from them. It was a slow process, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood belonged to the people again. The neighborhood transformed faster than I expected. Without the HOA's oppressive grip, people felt free to make their homes their own again. Flower beds that had been deemed too unkempt by the previous board now flourished. Driveways once scrutinized for minor cracks were being repaved by neighbors helping each other. The fear that had once blanketed the community had lifted, replaced by something none of us had seen in years, genuine camaraderie. But while the residents were moving forward, the legal battle wasn't quite finished. My father's lawyers were wrapping up the financial side of the lawsuit, ensuring that the liquidated HOA assets were distributed fairly among those affected. The restitution wouldn't undo the harm, but it was a start. I had spent the last week finalizing the framework for the homeowners coalition, carefully structuring it to prevent any one person from gaining unchecked control. Everything was coming together. Then, late one afternoon, I received a call that reignited my fury. It was Robert Langston, his voice clipped with urgency. The investigation into the HOA's financials had uncovered something even worse than we'd anticipated. It turned out that the corruption ran deeper than we thought. Karen Whitmore and her closest allies had been siphoning funds from the HOA for years, creating fraudulent maintenance projects, inflating administrative costs, and funneling money into personal accounts. The losses amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that wasn't the worst of it. The auditors had discovered that the HOA had been working with a shady real estate developer. Their plan had been simple: force homeowners into foreclosure through fabricated violations, seize their properties, and sell them to the developer at a fraction of their market value. My father's home was just one of many targets. The revelation sent a shockwave through the community. The neighborhood wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA, it had been at the center of an organized scheme to push long-term residents out for profit. With this new evidence, the legal case escalated. The district attorney's office expanded their charges against Karen and several of her co-conspirators. The developer they had been working with was now under federal investigation for fraud and racketeering. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the former board members, a man named Charles Abbott, requested a private meeting. Unlike Karen, Charles had always been more of a follower than a leader. He had been on the board for years, but he had never been vocal in enforcing their worst policies. Now, it seemed, he wanted to talk. We met at a small cafe just outside the neighborhood. He looked exhausted, his suit slightly wrinkled, his hands jittery as he stirred his coffee. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He admitted that he had known about the developer scheme but had been too afraid to speak up. Karen had kept a tight leash on her board members through intimidation and manipulation. Those who obeyed her were rewarded, those who questioned her were pushed out. He had stayed silent to protect himself, but now, with everything crumbling, he was ready to come clean. He provided documents, emails, meeting notes, and financial records that proved the scheme had been in the works for years. In exchange for his cooperation, he wanted leniency from the prosecution. I passed everything to Robert Langston, who immediately turned it over to the district attorney. The evidence was damning. It cemented the case against Karen and ensured that the corruption wouldn't just be swept under the rug. With Charles's testimony, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The entire fraudulent operation was exposed, and the people responsible for ruining countless lives were finally held accountable. By the time my father was discharged from the hospital, the legal battle was over. The neighborhood was free. On the day he came home, the entire community gathered to welcome him back. It was an emotional moment. People who had once lived in fear of the HOA were now standing together, stronger than ever. They had taken back their neighborhood, and they weren't going to let anyone abuse them again. As we stood in the empty lot where our home once stood, my father turned to me. His expression was contemplative, but there was a quiet satisfaction beneath it. "This isn't just about our house," he said. "It's about what was taken from this entire community." "And now they have it back." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The legal battle had been won. The HOA was dismantled. The corrupt board members were facing justice. But the real victory was the people, the neighbors who had reclaimed their rights, their voices, and their homes. In the weeks that followed, the Homeowners Coalition was officially formed. It wasn't a governing body, but a support network, a way for residents to work together without fear of abuse. Decisions were made collectively, and no one held unchecked power. And as for my father's home, we rebuilt. Not just the house, but the trust, the sense of community, and the belief that no one, not an HOA, not a corrupt board, not a greedy developer could take away what belonged to the people. Justice had been served, and this time it was permanent.